he asked, he believes in like the uncaused, first cause type thing, but he doesn't. He has to say, why does it have to be God? Why does it have to be the Christian God? Why can't it be whoever?
That's an excellent question, and what I would say to him, we can't prove it's the Christian God just from one argument. You can show, as Aristotle knew, there had to be an unmoved mover. And if you want to say just use one argument, the argument from the beginning of the universe, that space, matter, and time had a beginning out of nothing. This is not an Aristotle argument. This is an argument that's used today because Aristotle mistakenly thought the universe was eternal. But let's just take someone like Stephen Hawking, as you know, recently died, but he said almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. All right, let's just go with that. If space, matter, and time had a beginning, as I said earlier, whatever created space, matter, and time can't be made of space, matter, and time. The cause must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful to create the universe out of nothing, personal in order to choose to create, and also intelligent to make a choice to create. Now, does that show that this being is the Christian God? No. What it shows is that this being could be the Christian God. Do we know it's the Christian God? No, not yet. What do we need to do at this point? We need to look at the evidence for Jesus and see if Jesus really rose from the dead. At the end of the day, there's only two facts you need to show that Christianity is true. Number one, there's a God. Number two, Jesus rose from the dead. If those two facts are true, if there is a God and Jesus rose from the dead, then mark it down, Christianity is true. So you've got to look at historical evidence to see if Jesus truly rose from the dead. If he is, then the God who created the universe out of nothing is Jesus.
That was Dr. Frank Turek. He's an apologist. Apologetics means defending something. And in his case, he is defending literalist Christianity. In fact, he's teaching a class. In that video, he's got a room full of people that he is helping with apologetics. He's teaching them how to go out and argue for literalist Christianity. And he's fielding questions from people who have run into a problem somewhere or another. They've run into an argument that they need to know, hey, I've run into someone who's using this move and I don't know how to counter it. So it's like he's teaching almost a martial arts class. And I would say he's a little bit like the Cobra Kai martial arts class. They're going out and picking fights with other people. It's not necessarily just a self-defense class. And so he has someone coming up and saying, hey, I ran into this move and I need to know, what do I do when I run into this move? And he says, well, that's actually a very good question. You're being faced with the question of if there is, granted that there is a cause, a supernatural force or a supernatural being that is the first cause, how do we know that that's the literalist Christian God? Well, that's actually a very good question. And he says, you don't, unless you then believe that the resurrection is true, a literal historical resurrection of a literal figure named Jesus who came into terrestrial history and experienced the crucifixion and the resurrection. Well, we might ask, why didn't he start at the beginning of Genesis and say, well, you don't, once you've accepted that there's a creator, you don't know that it's the literalist God that I'm explaining, that I'm describing to you, unless you believe in a literal figure named Adam that he created in the Garden of Eden, and then he literally took the rib and literally created the woman out of the rib, and then there was a literal serpent that came along and literally spoke to the woman about some literal fruit in a literal tree. Why didn't he say that? Because actually, theologically, the literalist explanation of the crucifixion, which I would argue it is a distortion of the message, points back to the Garden of Eden story. That's actually the literalist explanation for why there had to be a crucifixion. So why doesn't he say that you had to have a literalist understanding of Adam and a literal understanding of Eve and a literal serpent, literal tree? literal expulsion from a literal Eden? Well, because it's very difficult to argue. I would argue it's difficult to argue for a literal Adam and a literal Eve because it's a metaphor. But actually, many literalists at this point in history are comfortable saying, yeah, I don't necessarily need to believe in a literal serpent that spoke to the literal woman. In fact, I don't need to believe in a literal Adam and Eve for there to be truth that comes out of that story just because it's literal. Not literal doesn't mean that there's not truth in it. You know, I'd say that's right. I would agree. So why not the same position for the crucifixion, resurrection? Because actually that can be shown to be based on celestial metaphor as well. The Adam and Eve story is based on celestial metaphor. It can be shown to be based on celestial metaphor. The constellations that play the role of the man and the woman and the serpent, there's a serpent constellation that's cast out of the garden, and a man and a woman, they rise up in the east and they sink down into the west, and they're cast out of paradise, the garden. And then there's actually a cherubim that rise up in the east. That's a different constellation that rises in the east of Eden after they're cast out. And that's why the man, there's a verse that says to him, from dust thou came, and then that's the eastern horizon. To dust shalt thou return. The casting out of the garden is a casting out of the heavens. And then there's a angel that rises in the east of Eden. That's another constellation. This can all be shown to be celestial metaphor. It doesn't mean it's not true. It does mean it's not literal terrestrial history. Now you can probably see where I'm going with this. I would argue that it is also teaching profound truths, but it's not. It can be shown to be based on the constellations, just as the rest of the New Testament stories can also be seen to be based on celestial metaphor. When John the Baptist sees Jesus coming to him and says, behold the Lamb of God which taketh away the sins of the world, that's because the constellation which plays John the Baptist, you can probably figure out which one it is. It's the constellation Aquarius, is looking, the constellation itself appears to be looking towards the constellation Aries, the ram, or the lamb which taketh away the sins of the world. And then he says, but one cometh after me, which is greater than I. That's talking about yet another constellation. I've explained this in some other videos, also in my writings. It's not a literal scene at the River Jordan. It didn't happen literally at the terrestrial River Jordan. It happened beside the celestial river of the Milky Way. And when Aquarius is talking about one that cometh after me that is more powerful than I, that's talking about the constellation Orion, which is a much larger and more powerful constellation than Aquarius. And his fan is in his hand. I've explained this in other videos that show that the upraised arm of the constellation Orion is holding what appears as a winnowing fan in myths around the world, not just in the New Testament, also in the Old Testament, also in the Odyssey of ancient Greece. These constellations, that's why you have echoes in myths around the world, because they have similar characteristics in different myths around the world. But this scene where John says, he must increase and I must decrease, that's celestial. But it's esoteric. It's teaching something very profound to us. It's talking to us about the higher self and our lower self, our ordinary self. He must increase, I must decrease. It's a celestial metaphor. It has profound truth in it, but it's not literally true. And the same can be said of the other parts of the gospel account. They are teaching profound truths, but they do not have to be literally true. In fact, I would argue that when you start to understand them the way they're actually teaching, which is esoterically, you will begin to see profound and life-changing and very beneficial truths that can be a tremendous blessing to you. And you don't lose You don't lose any of the good parts. You lose the bad parts that come from trying to force them into being literally true. What has happened is you have this literalist Christian faith, which is going around and teaching and spreading this literalist understanding. That's exactly what that academy, that little clip comes from Dr. Turek teaching other people how to literally argue for a literalist interpretation of the scriptures and argue people into understanding that, yes, if there's a God, it must be the way we tell you it is based on this literalist interpretation. When actually those stories are teaching profound truths in an esoteric way, and they're based on the very same constellations and stars that other myths and sacred stories around the world are also based on. And yet literalist Christianity feels like they have to go around and stamp out those other belief systems. Oh, they're wrong, because we have the literal truth. We have the literal historical truth and nobody else does. So we're going to stamp out these other myths. The stories in the Bible, if you want to believe them to be literal and you get profound truths, you don't need to believe them to be literal to get the profound truth out of it. I just demonstrated that with Adam and Eve. But if you want to, I don't have any argument with people who want to believe them as literally true and say, I much prefer to believe them as being literally true. That's fine. The problem is when you're going out and creating a world-building political system based on them, which literalist Christianity is. It's been demonstrated for 1,700 years. Dr. Turek admits it's a political system. Literalist Christianity that he's spreading with an apologetics academy to teach people how to argue you out of whatever you were believing before and into believing it literally, that's completely different. So if you want to believe it literally yourself, I don't have any problem with that. But if you go out and assault others with your literal interpretation, then people should have some form of self-defense against that assault. So I don't have any problem with people believing literally in something. It's when they start to assault people with the consequences of that and the political beliefs that are based on that can be shown to have had some negative repercussions, which once you start to understand that they're not literal, you don't have those negative repercussions anymore, but you still have all the truth and beauty. If you prefer to look at the truth and beauty that are in the biblical scriptures rather than the Vedas, that's fine. But the Vedas are based on the same celestial system, and they're conveying the same profound truths, actually. The real question is, if you see enough evidence that it's actually esoteric, if you see enough evidence that it's actually celestial metaphor, then what do? I changed my paradigm when I saw enough evidence. The question for people who are foisting a literalist interpretation on other people is, what if someone brought you enough evidence to show you that, just like the story of Adam and Eve, you don't have to take it literally in order for it to be true, in order for it to have profound truths and profound blessings for your life? Because you don't. It's not literal.